Welcome back, fellow adventurers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we're going to explore transmedia storytelling within established IPs, and who better to guide us through this fascinating terrain than the esteemed Richard Dansky. With a storied career spanning narrative direction, fiction writing, and game design, Richard's insight will illuminate our path as we explore this space. While our discussion finds ground within the world of darkness and the work that Richard did at White Wolf, we do explore other topics and other IPs. So, Richard, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to sit down and dig into your history and your work that you've done over the years, especially World of Darkness stuff. That's something that I fell in love with very young and enjoyed. So, but first, before we get into all that, I'd like to start with a little grounding of how you fell in love with gaming and writing, how you got into the industry, your path along the way, just kind of your origin story, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I started making games when I was maybe 8 years old. I took a piece of spare formica from my parents' kitchen remodeling, drew a grid on it, and started making games with Matchbox cars. And I've been doing that my whole life. I've been writing stories my whole life. Got into tabletop RPGs in high school, middle school and high school. Got into LARPs in college. Got into writing for tabletop RPGs when I was in grad school, courtesy of a friend from Wesleyan named Jennifer Hartshorn, who was the original Wraith developer, and did some wonderful work on that. And I moved down to Atlanta in 1995 to take over Wraith and Mind's Eye Theater. Stayed at White Wolf for 4 years, worked on a lot of projects that I'm very proud of. And at the end of that time, I was feeling I sort of needed a new challenge. And a friend of mine at Red Storm, Dave Weinstein, reached out and said, hey, you should try video games. So I took a shot, and much to my surprise, they hired me. And I've been in video games for 25 years now, writing, designing, narrative directing, and mainly working on the story and writing side of things.
Oh, really cool. Okay, well, let's dive in. The topic of the day today is storytelling within established IPs across various formats and mediums. So let's kind of start broad and start moving our way in here. With your extensive experience in narrative direction, narrative design, and writing, I'm curious, from a big step back, what are some of the unique challenges and perhaps opportunities working in an established IP like World of Darkness?
The benefit is easy right off the bat. One, you have an established fan base. You have people who love this already. You don't have to explain the world to them. They know it already. They've already bought in. You don't have to tell Batman's origin story every goddamn movie. Sorry, did I say that out loud?
Maybe.
Well, there's a reason. But you also have the walls of the sandbox already built. You don't have to build those walls. You don't have to reestablish the rules. You don't have to explain everything. You can concentrate on getting more granular within the space that's already defined. And so that gives more room for artistry and fine detail work than if you were making the whole thing up on your own and have to build the foundations of the project. You have to build the walls of the sandbox. So that was always really helpful to me in working in things like the World of Darkness. Okay, the laws are defined, the world is defined. What can I do within that space? The negative, obviously, is that as an IP goes along, it tends to accumulate years and years and years and years of lore, much of which is often contradictory or confusing or lost or hidden on a floppy drive marked beer or something like that. You laugh, but some files for Mind's Eye Theater were actually on a floppy disk marked beer.
Well, that wasn't just made up. That's an actual thing.
That apparently at one point they were talking about doing a White Wolf microbrewery or something, and that's what the floppy disk said. So
that's great.
I'm sure they'll deny it, but that was the truth because I had that disk.
A great story. So when you mentioned lore and managing all the information, have you seen any rather effective or interesting ways of managing lore and keeping it all together and organized?
Lore expands beyond all comprehension. It is really hard to keep track of, and it is especially hard to keep track of in a central location if you are generating it at the same time you're trying to catalog it. Now, a lot of IP houses have someone whose job it is to wrangle the lore. And that's the best solution. If you're big enough and profitable enough and your IP is big enough, have someone who is a lore wrangler there to make sure that every single bit gets cataloged, is available, is accessible. So if the devs need it, they can access it. Failing that, and this is going to get me in trouble, fans have a tremendous memory for this stuff and a love of organizing it. And I am not proud, and I will say that more than once I have gone to a fan wiki to double check what I thought I remembered and gotten good information off of fan wiki from fans who are so thorough and so invested. So thank you to those fans.
Yeah, I've heard other studios do something similar where they kind of fan source their wiki. So it's got to do what you got to do. I'm just completely riffing off here. Do you have a favorite IP out there and all the many, many IPs that are in the world?
There are a lot of IPs I love. The one IP character I would absolutely murder someone to write for is The Question, the DC Comics character.
Cool. Yeah, that's an interesting deep dive. I like that. That's cool.
Yeah. When I was in college, I had fallen out of comic books for a few years, and the local comic store had Free Comics Day, and they bundled me up with a bunch of issues of the Denny O'Neil, Dennis Cowan Question run, and I fell in love. And so I appreciate that character for getting me back into comics.
Have you written, I didn't see any comics in my research on you. Is that something you've dabbled your toes in, or is that something you would want to do, is write for comics?
I would love to do it. While I was at Ubisoft, I actually got asked to write a couple of Splinter Cell comic books that never saw the light of day. I did help with the plotting of one Splinter Cell comic that did get published.
That would be
but
cool.
That's the closest I've come to a writing comics credit, apart from little comic sections in various White Wolf products. But yeah, I would absolutely love to write comics. There's a possible project on my horizon that, if everything goes well, we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's a bucket list item for me.
Cool. Okay, well, let's dive back into a little White Wolf stuff, a little World of Darkness stuff. I'm curious, what's your personal approach to storytelling, world building, but mostly storytelling in worlds that are so inherently dark and immersive, those kinds of environments? How do you bake that into your writing when you're working on that kind of thing?
It is all about the characters. The characters make the world. The characters interact with the world and make it interesting and palatable. Wraith had the benefit of tying its character motivations into its mechanics with passions and fetters. Mm-hmm. And so that was a really tight bond, and that really drove great role playing. But, the point is, you make great characters that identify with a setting, that provide access to a setting, that provide connection to a setting. You're halfway there just to start. And so, that was something I emphasized with my writers was, making sure the human connection was there, making sure they had strong characters, they had characters people wanted to interact with. I also told them they had to do one story hook per paragraph or I was coming after them, but that's neither here nor there.
You sound like an old Dragon magazine editor or something. I know a couple. Yeah, right.
I was doing this in the 90s, man. This was back when, Oasis was popular. I mean,
she'll make me feel old in a second here. Okay, that's World of Darkness. I'm curious, how does your process change? What changes when it's like working for something like Hunt Showdown or Tom Clancy's or something like that? Is there different techniques and tools in world building outside of such a dark setting?
Well, Hunt's a pretty dark setting in and of itself.
Yeah, as soon as I said that, I was thinking,
swamp.
Yeah.
But when you move into an IP like that, the first thing you have to do is examine the pillars of the brand and figure out what makes something Clancy, what makes something Hunt. Mm-hmm. And that was the first thing I did in both of those assignments. In terms of Clancy, you read his books, you see the movies, and there are some very clear pillars. It is the near future. It is the clear and present danger. It is the use of high technology. It is the righteous use of force to solve a global threat, and so on and so forth. And so those story pillars are the things you measure every story and every character for a Tom Clancy game up against. Those are the ones that define the golden circle. Those are the ones that are the walls of the sandbox. And if the story doesn't fit, no matter how great it is, it's not a Clancy story. If the story does fit and it's not that great, well, you're in the sandbox and you can improve it.
When you say the story doesn't fit and you change it, you remind me, of course, of the story stack Jesse Shell talks about. Are you familiar? You're familiar with the story stack concept that the player? So I'm curious, with that established, the player fantasy, how does that line up when a player sits down to play something? How does it line up with an established IP's story pillars as you describe them?
Well, ideally, the franchise's story pillars create a narrative fantasy that aligns with the player fantasy. You want to do the thing that the character wants to do because the game does it well. Mm-hmm. So you are motivated in a Splinter Cell game to go sneak around and steal high-tech data and snap some necks in the dark or whatever, because that's what that character does, and you have good reasons to do it in terms of national security or, something personal that's happening or whatever. And you have a good game reason to do it because that's what the game does well and it feels good to do it. You align those two fantasies, you intertwine them, you have a really satisfying game experience.
That makes sense. When you wander into that space and all those constraints and all those pillars are already in place for you to work within, how do you find somewhere to put yourself? How do you put Richard's thumbprint on something that is already so established?
Research. Read everything that's there. Find what has been built. That tells you where the empty spaces are. Research beyond what is there into more stuff that's in the field, in the category, and see what you can pull in. With the Clancy games, for example, I was an omnivorous reader of geopolitical journals and things like War is Boring and stuff like that. Looking for the conflicts that were on the back pages, not the front pages. Looking at the brushfire wars, looking at the places where dirty deeds were being done in the dark that would translate to good stories. And if you look at, the Clancy novels, they are big stories. They are big fights. That left a lot of space on the rest of the map to do these smaller incidents that could have big repercussions, but weren't being covered in the stuff that was there already.
Right. Is it similar when you're working on a tabletop where, again, we're back to White Wolf and World of Darkness, you walk in, there's so much established, but you can still find space to put your own stamp?
Absolutely. I had a ton of free reign with Wraith because I had the whole underworld to play with, and it was largely undefined. And I had the Labyrinth to play with, which was largely undefined. And I had, the Shadowlands, which, apart from places like Atlanta, had not really been defined. And so there was a ton of blue water space for me, as the venture capital people say. And there was an incredible amount of inspiration available in all the horror reading that I had done and all the horror games that I had played, and all the history that I had read. Okay, so let's veer off to a side for a second. Transmedia storytelling that jumps from games to book to film to all over the place, but still maintains a storyline. This is becoming more and more prevalent these days. And I'm curious, in your experience, how do you keep the story, the world, the tone even, consistent and coherent across all these media? You empower an editor. The buck has to stop with someone. They have to have the authority to say, yes, this is good. No, this is bad. You run everything past that person. You listen to them when they say this needs to change. And if you do that, then everything is in sync and you have a perfectly synchronized transmedia experience. If people get cute and hide stuff and try and sneak it past and run off into the weeds with what they think the IP should be as opposed to what is established, then you get stuff that's disjointed and you get continuity errors and you get unhappy fans.
Yeah. So it's important to have that one person who's going to maintain the vision throughout the whole process.
Yes. You really need somebody who is the visionary for the IP to wrangle the transmedia stuff.
And that person, I suppose, has to be strong enough to stand up to some talent. Like somebody shows up with a lot of talent and personality and another strong vision that doesn't maybe necessarily work, then you got to make sure that editor is a strong person who can hold the reins, I would assume.
Absolutely. And that editor needs support as well.
That's important to mention. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm maybe you can't think of one, but can you think of a case where that didn't go well, or perhaps that went really well, where you've seen somebody in that position and the IP was maintained well or poorly?
I'll give you a classic one, Star Wars.
Yeah. Okay.
West End Games, if I remember correctly, back in the day, West End Games had someone on staff with Lucas to verify everything they were doing for the Star Wars role-playing game and making sure it was in sync with what they were doing at the mothership. And they liked that content so much that an awful lot of it ended up canon.
That's cool. That's the
so
dream.
My
right
favorite
there.
was there was a note that came back on one adventure. Apparently the rebels dumped their garbage and jumped to hyperspace. And the note came back from California saying, "We feel the rebels would be more ecologically conscious than this."
I suppose there's a fair point there.
It's space. It's big. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so you, as we've mentioned a number of times, you've worked across a lot of different media, video games, novels, tabletop games. From a craft point of view, because this is a craft podcast on top of just a fan and fun podcast. From a craft point of view, what are some of the technical differences in writing for each of these different media?
Games are interactive. Fiction and media and movies and TV are not.
Mm-hmm.
That is the biggest difference. That is the wall that many people cannot get over. I have seen very talented people in linear media throw themselves at games and simply not been able to really grasp that it's not their story, it's the player's story.
That makes sense.
That is the big difference. The phrase I've been using for 15 years now is the player-shaped hole. There's a player-shaped hole at the beginning of, or at the heart of every story. It is filled by the player when they pick up the controller or their mouse, and then they become the hero of the story. We, as game writers, create narrative. We create the elements that the player interacts with, but that sit there idle until the player comes along, at which point they activate and become part of that player's unique personal story. Or to put it another way, you have played games, yes?
Oh, yeah. Too many.
You have told stories of playing games, yes?
Indeed.
What is the first word of every sentence you have ever told about something you did in game? I will bet you money it is I.
Oh, yeah, obviously.
I did this. I killed the dragon. I saved the princess, you know. And it is the player who is the hero of that story. And so you need to remember that. You are not writing your story. You are not saving the best lines for yourself. You are not controlling things. You are not writing to a strict pace. It's all in the player's hands. And your job is to make the player feel good for doing whatever the player does. So that's a big difference.
Indeed. So there's an there's a very old debate, and I'm sure you've been part of it many times, on this topic, between player agency and crafting an emotionally resonant or fulfilling story as a writer, as somebody who wants to craft a story. And people fall at different points along this scale. I'm curious, and you've obviously hinted at it, but I'm curious, how do you go about balancing that whole idea of giving players enough agency versus making sure that the story ends up somewhere meaningful?
I'm a big fan of what Lee Sheldon called the well-fed snake model, which is that you have a narrative that at many points expands very widely to give the player a tremendous amount of agency. And then once they've done everything they can in that space, in that narrative space, once they progress through it to the best of their ability, there's a little bit of a pinch. There's a little bit of a tightening. There's a moment that everything funnels through. And there you have, that gives the writer a little more control at that point, and then it broadens out again. And that's good for single player games and linear narratives. For open world stuff, this is heresy, but I feel a lot of them actually are built in structures of many, 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 many parallel small linear narratives that each have those constructions to them. But the game as a whole is not a single narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that
But really, again, it all boils down to the characters. If your characters are good, you can have an emotionally resonant moment. pretty much doing anything. The story I tell about Sand Guy from the original Far Cry. Yep. You've heard that story, right?
I haven't heard the story you're going to tell, no. I played the game, but no.
So I was working on the original Far Cry script, and Far Cry is about a guy on a series of islands making his way to a mad scientist lab, and various and sundry things happen, and he picks up various superpowers along the way, and one of them is super hearing. So you can eavesdrop on all the guards and all the beaches. And this meant that all the guards on all the beaches had to have something to say, whether it was game pertinent information or stuff about the world or just an interesting conversation to eavesdrop on.
Okay.
And there were a lot of them. And by the time we got to like guard 84 or whatever, I was pretty zonked. I said, you know what? They're going to talk about sand. They're going to talk about sand. And so I have these two guys talking. One of them starts complaining about how he's got sand in his shoes or something, and he hates the beach. And the other one says, no, I love the beach. I grew up in Philly, which I did. And, we'd go down the Jersey Shore on the weekend, and it was the best thing ever. And, it's just little throwaway dialogue for Guard 84 and Guard 85. More bodies on the way to the big boss fight, right?
Right.
2005, I do a panel at E3 on game writing. And as I step off the stage, I am mobbed by a group of students from New Jersey. And they want to talk to me about Sand Guy. And they say one of them was playing the game and had their sniper rifle and was ready to pop Sand Guy when he heard the conversation and said, I can't do this. I know that guy. I am that guy. And so their whole player groups found a way to change their play style to avoid killing those two random guards on a beach because they had that moment of emotional connection with a random bit of dialogue that I had put in. And that was a tremendously educational moment for me and something that has impacted all the game writing I've done since then.
That's brilliant. I was going to ask, did you take a lesson from that and apply it? But yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
So cool.
Yes, absolutely.
That is so cool. Okay, so kind of along the similar lines, when you move to tabletop role-playing games and you're creating rule sets or source books or modules or campaigns or one-shots or whatever it is you're creating for a tabletop game, how do you create meaningful narratives in those spaces, or at least provide the tools in a meaningful way?
You give people things they can expand. Like I said, I told my writers one hook per paragraph minimum. The point of tabletop writing, by and large, is to be outward. It is to give the players, the actual players and the GMs, the tools to take a story from the book and tell something bigger, something more, using what you have given them as a starting point. What you have given them has to be the seed, has to be something that they can expand upon logically and rationally and easily. So your characters have to make sense doing things. You have to write a character that's good enough whereby if that character gets dropped in a new situation, the GM should know what that character is going to do. And so, again, I keep on saying it comes back to character, but it really, really does. Character motivation, character personality, character relationships, those power what happens when the players interact with them.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's as much as I loved, B2 Keep on the Borderlands and the giant map full of rooms full of goblins and whatever else, I grew to love more games and situations where the encounter was based on who I was interacting with and not, which spell I was using to interact with them to, mop the floor with them.
Right.
Did that make sense?
100% it does. To tie back to the idea of IPs, how much of the IP property, the brand property or the voice of the IP ties into when you're creating those characters? Like, obviously you're trying to create characters that are going to create those emotional moments and emotional resonance and tell good stories. How much consideration is there of the IP properties that have to go into those characters? Is that an element?
It's a very strong element. You want your characters to stand for that IP. You want them to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, you want them to be iconic. And so you want them to manifest the properties of the IP in a way that's easy for people to access and digest and sympathize with and admire. And I'll tell you a secret from the White Wolf days, actually. There's a reason we sold 9 zillion little cloisonne clan pins. And it ties into why when we did the collected clan books for Dark Ages and the Libella Sanguinis stuff, those didn't sell nearly as well as the single clan books. Now the Libella Sanguinis books were much bigger, much longer, and a much better deal in terms of what you were paying for what you got. But the solo clan books outsold them monstrously. And this was because people didn't want extraneous content. They said, I am a Bruja, I am a Lasombra, I am a Ventrue. And they didn't want to pay for the content that wasn't them. They identified personally. The words I am kept on getting used. And so that was an interesting lesson in terms of fan identification, player identification with the symbols and the identities we were putting out there.
The psychology of personal identity is a very powerful force that writers really need to have an understanding of, I think. That's a big deal. Yeah, I had a friend sorry, go ahead.
You go. You go.
Oh, I was just gonna say I had a friend who basically thought he was a gangrel all the time. Like, we'd go out to the bar, he thought he was a gang. Like, that's just who he was. So I get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now we had pictures of folks, sending us, of their tattoos that they had gotten, of clan symbols, of werewolf tribe symbols. I think there was one Wraith guild symbol tattoo, but that was it. I did have a Wraith guild fridge magnet once, but
that's cool. I miss those games. I haven't played in forever. I should dust out the old books.
Come back. 20th anniversary edition Wraith is awesome. Or so they tell me.
I was a mage GM forever. I would go back to Mage probably first, but yeah, Wraith is cool. Don't get me wrong. I loved Wraith, but Mage was my first love in that world.
I understand. Somewhere Phil Brucato just went.
Okay, let's. You rock, Richard. You're fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Let's go back to narrative design for a second. We're all over the place today, but there is a question that came up in conversations and in classes I've taken recently, and it's this idea of finding a way to test narrative concepts early in dev cycles, like way back in ideation, a way to prototype a narrative concept. I'm curious, A, have you ever seen anything like this? And B, have you ever considered it or tried something yourself?
I have seen it. I have done it. A lot of times it's done with paper role-playing. People do paper prototypes and pen and pencil prototypes and test stuff out that way. And you do it right, it can be a lot of fun, and it can be very, very informative.
Mm-hmm. So, on a completely different topic, GDC was a few weeks ago, and you are one of the curators of the Narrative Summit. So first of all, that's incredible. That summit is so powerful and so useful. What you guys are doing there is incredible. You folks are doing there, because there's lots of different people there. But I'm curious, based on your experience there, what you see every year, your learnings, what do you foresee for the future of storytelling in digital games?
Getting bigger and better. The AI conversation is the AI conversation. I'm not qualified to have that at this point. I have my opinions, but I don't know enough to say anything definitive, and I'm not going to stick my foot in my mouth. I'm just mad that they used one of my books to train the AIs. That being said, I think we've got incredible storytelling possibilities coming up with new technologies, with a better understanding of storytelling in VR, with a better understanding of storytelling in AR. As we do more games as a service and get more comfortable with them and expand what sort of things we do in those, there's great storytelling opportunities there as well. As the hardware we use gets better and better, then we can tell bigger and more complex stories. I mean, you look at something like Baldur's Gate 3, it has an insane amount of complexity and it has an insane amount of content. And God bless them for it. It is wonderful. But we couldn't do that until the hardware caught up. As ambitious as that campaign is in Baldur's Gate 3, 10 years ago, it would have had to have been a pen and paper game, because there's no way the hardware could have supported it. So, God bless them for doing it, and I am a fan. You look at something like that, that's where the future is going. I like to think, at the same time, we've got these big projects like Baldur's Gate 3 that take, like the Rockstar games, that take forever, so they can be so highly polished and so highly crafted and so complete that our industry is mature enough to support more of those games. So we have those incredible experiences. And at the same time, I love the blossoming of indie games with their other types of stories, with their shorter stories, with their different stories, without, while broadening the menu that there's there for the player. Sometimes you want a gourmet meal, sometimes you want a cheeseburger, or sometimes you want a spectacularly made Belgian chocolate bonbon. I will die on the hill that the original Oxenfree had some of the best game dialogue ever written. I will fight forever for Edith Finch as one of the best narrative games ever made. And every game has an appropriate amount of narrative. That doesn't mean every game should have more narrative. Doesn't mean every game should have less narrative. Every game has an appropriate amount of narrative to tell its story, to create its player experience. And if you find that balance and match it with the gameplay, you have something magical. It doesn't matter if it's big or small.
Nice. Yep. I like that. Things to look forward to.
Well, thank you.
So what were some of the highlights? What would you say is a highlight of GDC? Just to put a pin in that. What was a highlight this year for you?
It was glorious from start to finish for me. I've been doing this, 20 plus years, and this was probably my best GDC. And I say that in all honesty. Everything that I saw was fantastic. The Narrative Summit, the talks were all absolutely dead on. Brilliant stuff, great presenters. The audience really appreciated it. Could not have asked for better speakers and better audience. The student competition winners, really sharp, really organized, very, very thoughtful. They took perfect advantage of the opportunity that was given them, which is why we do the competition. They had organized themselves for group photos and taking pictures of their posters when they came up on the TV, and they did a business card swap, and they recognized they're each other's peers going forward. So they built connections, they networked, they moved as a pack and hung out and developed together. And it was wonderful. I am so proud of those students, one, for the work that they did to get themselves to GDC, and two, for the way they handled the opportunity. And I know old man is proud of kids, but I really am very proud of them, and I hope they take that in the way it is intended. And we did Write Club, which is the IGA Writer Sig annual event, which is improvisational game writing competition. Basically, whose line is it anyway for game writers? And we had 35 entrants, and we had dozens more we had to turn away because the room was already packed. And that was a glorious time. People had a lot of fun with that. And then I did 2 narrative roundtables at the show, one on professional topics, which was basically, how do you get the job? How do you do the job? How do you keep the job? And wonderful, wonderful conversations, people contributing at all levels of experience, people asking smart questions, people asking things respectfully, and a real sense of community, which is why I run those roundtables. Writing and narrative are really lonely jobs at a lot of studios. You don't have anybody else there who speaks your professional language. And so to gather 90 narrative professionals in a room where they can all speak the same professional language, they can all speak the jargon, where they've all shared the same triumphs and tribulations and hassles and, oh God, yes, that happened to you too. That is a wonderful thing. It provides incredible support to people who think they're alone. It helps build networking, it helps build knowledge, and it makes the craft better. And I am both humbled by it and very proud to have facilitated that for these many years through GDC.
You make me feel bad that I missed it, but I'm definitely going to plan for next year. And that student competition, that is an incredible, incredible program. So thank you for putting that out there into the world. That's changes lives. So, wow.
It's really important to me. I know this is going to sound a little Pollyannish, but when I got into the industry in '99, people who had established track records and careers were very kind to me and showed me the ropes and, picked me up for my mistakes and reached out to me when they didn't have to. And there was nothing in it for them other than helping someone else out. And that made a tremendous impact on me. that folks like Brian Upton and Kevin Perry, that folks like Steve Moretsky and Bob Bates and Noah Falstein were so generous with their time and their knowledge. And that if I were ever in a position like that, to do that, I would. I am lucky enough that for a very long time, I've been in a position to do stuff like that. And my employers have been generous enough to allow me to continue to do so. And it has been a source of great pride to me that I have been able to share my knowledge, that I have been able to, do this competition and hopefully inspire students to think about narrative analysis, pick up that toolkit, and hopefully use it in their careers going forward. And, get them to the show, get them to a place where they can network, get them to a place where they can talk to the people who are doing the job day to day and do something good for them and help the next generation the way I was helped. And all I have to them is that when it comes their turn, they do the same.
Right on. Well, that brings us to the end of the serious questions. I have a thing I like to call, edit that. So that brings us to the end of the serious questions, but there is one more question that I like to ask everybody. It's the question that lives at the heart of this little social experiment of mine. That question is, in my opinion, there is a magical space where stories and games intersect, but also improv, comedians, songwriters, actors, comic book writers, all of these people meet, hang out. We all have a kind of a shared language. If you agree with me, not everybody does, but if you do, in your opinion, what is the magical thread that holds that together?
Alcohol.
Okay, so you just won. No, that's the best answer. You win.
No, I know great many wonderful creative people who do not drink at all. But the prevalence of the bar as a social hang at science fiction conventions and horror conventions, things like that, and game developer conventions cannot be overstated. I will say the first GDC I went to was in San Jose, and we were at the Fairmont Hotel bar, and I was wandering around with a glass of scotch, and I ran into the estimable Noah Falstein, who was one of my game design gods growing up, and whose tutorial I had taken earlier in the week. And we sort of bumped into each other, and I went, Glenfiddich? And he went, McAllen? And we just sort of nodded and went our separate ways. But that was a moment. That was a moment we had right there. But really, it's social space. And whether that's with lemonade or Coke Zero or fine scotch or anything, just the being together in a safe, comfortable space where you can express yourself, your craft, your questions, where you can be vulnerable and thus grow is what matters.
Good answer. Okay. Almost out the door here. I like to do a little quick fire, just to pick your brain, just to get to know you a little better, share a little insight. First of all, what are you currently playing?
I am currently actually neck deep in reading.
Oh,
I have a whole slew of friends who have given me their unpublished novels to read for feedback.
Oh.
And so that is eating my brain at the moment. They are all really nice, really well-written books, and I am giving them the time and attention they deserve. So I'm taking a little break from games at the moment. When I am done, it is going to be probably back into Baldur's Gate 3, unless I can find a walking simulator that gets good recommendations. I love walking simulators.
Me too. What's
storytelling that can be done in those?
Okay, well, now we're going to go off on a complete tangent, but my favorite probably genre is like walking simulators and survival crafting kind of games, but where there's story told through environmental storytelling. So Sons of the Forest has a lot of it. The Long Dark is really strong in it. Stuff like that, where you don't just get the story, you have to take it in. I love those ones. Yeah.
No, I agree with you completely. I'm a huge fan of environmental storytelling. We had a glorious moment on the First Division game, actually. I had called all the writers to Red Storm for a writers' summit, and we had a fantastic time, doing table reads of scripts and workshopping stuff. And it was intrinsic to getting the game done. I would not trade that week for anything. It was wonderful. But one day, the folks who are working on the Dark Zone, the PvP area of the game, came down. The level builders and artists said, "Hey, we don't have dialogue in the Dark Zone. We don't have formal narrative in the Dark Zone, but we want to tell stories in this space. Can you give us 20 story prompts that we can tell visually in this space that we could, tell with props and bodies and lights and graffiti and things like that?" And we said, absolutely. And we dropped what we were doing and we immediately started brainstorming on that. And while the first 2 words out of anybody's mouth were, and I quote, "Dead Santas," we more than hit our 20 list. We were having a fabulous time doing it. Really enjoyed it. Really got into the spirit of it. I gave it back to the team working on the Dark Zone. They were very appreciative. And if you go back to the Division 1 and go through the Dark Zone, you will see those little moments of storytelling that we collaborated with them with. And it adds an incredible amount of depth that most people don't even realize. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't jump up and down. It doesn't pull the eye. Mm-hmm. It just makes the world feel real. It makes the world feel inhabited. So many game worlds feel like the plastic just came off. And that was something I was incredibly proud of, what the narrative team combined with the level building and art teams did in that space.
You have every right to be proud of that. You've kind of wandered into one of my obsessions, and I played the hell out of Division 1. I haven't played Division 2, but playing Division 1, Dark Zones, exactly what you're talking about, when I was experiencing that game in that area, a lot of it reminded me of the things you can discover in DayZ. I don't know if you've ever played DayZ, but it's very much a walking sim, and you'll walk into somewhere, a road in the middle of the woods, and you'll come across a car, and there's something has happened, and there's body or blood or pieces, and you have to piece together the story of the family that was here, and the wolves came, and I love that stuff. So from me personally, thank you. That was probably my favorite part of Division 1.
You are quite welcome, and I will pass those thanks on to the folks who worked on that.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Fallout actually also did a wonderful job of storytelling like that, the Fallout series. So kudos to them.
Agreed. So that kills what are we currently playing and what are we currently reading. So what is the best advice you've ever received? And this could be career, life, dating.
Okay. 2 things. The best advice I ever got from my father.
Mm-hmm.
Dad was a fixer. He was a lawyer and an accountant and a sales manager and all sorts of things rolled into one. But basically, he was a problem solver. And he sat me down very young and he said, "Son, you have to understand the first rule is standing in a hole. Stop digging."
Mm.
And that has served me very well. You're in a situation, look around, don't make it worse. Figure out what you're doing wrong and stop doing that. The best writing advice I ever got, I got from a man named George Sithers, who was the publisher of Weird Tales back in the day. And he said it came down to 3 things. Have something to say it, and say it to someone. So have the idea for the story. Actually write the story instead of telling everybody what a great story idea you have. And then send it out. Let people read it, give you feedback, send it to markets, let an audience see it. It does you no good on your hard drive. I mean, yes, you can do I'm going to die and leave my house full of poems tied up with neat little ribbons. That always works once, and it's been done. Emily Dickinson had that shtick. It's over.
Yeah. Solid advice. Okay, last quick fire question. If you could host a game with any 4 people, living or dead, from any time in history, who would they be, and what would you play?
Ooh. Okay. Let me think for a minute. I will tell you the first name I would put on there would be Roger Zelazny.
Okay.
Brilliant author, also a big gamer.
Did not know that.
No. I would probably add Alfred Bester, another wonderful, witty, wise author who apparently came up with the Green Lantern Oath. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's the story.
Okay.
And he wrote The Star's My Destination, which is an utter classic. Let me see. I would not want to play with H.P. Lovecraft as much as his work has been a foundation of horror. I have a feeling he'd be a terrible rules lawyer.
Yeah.
Probably Clark Ashton Smith then. He seemed like much more fun. And Patterson Hood from the Drive-By Truckers.
That's out of the left field. Right on.
Well, that's what I do. I am about the left field.
What would you play? What's the game?
Villains and Vigilantes.
Wow, I haven't heard that one yet. Nice.
Yeah, it's easy system. Your characters are based on you. You basically take yourself, roll some random dice, turn into a superhero, and then start punching people in the face. It was a glorious system. I played it in high school. I ran it for 4 years in college.
Mm-hmm.
Had a ton of fun with it. It was something that I could introduce non-role players to in a heartbeat, and they got it. And there is something to be said for that level of accessibility and that level of just pure, clean fun. Yep. An easy fantasy that can turn into easy play.
Yeah. You got to have one of those systems in your pocket just for when this game happens.
Yes. I love Wraith. Wraith will always be in my heart. Wraith is my favorite system.
Oh, good.
We had so much fun. The campaign that I ran at White Wolf, whether it be the time we actually scared one of the layout artists out of the building by playing, or, we got one of the players so turned around they weren't sure which was the harrowing and which was the actual game setting. But it was a glorious, intense, fun, fascinating, and educational campaign. And I love that game to death. But it is something that I would only play with people that I trust to be serious role players and who can handle the maturity of the subject matter.
Yeah, agreed. Do you still play tabletop today? Like, do you still have a game you're running or in? Or
I have been in an occasional game with a bunch of game writer friends. It's being run by Jesse Scoble, who is a narrative director out of Montreal. And we have to play another session because we are one session away from the end, and it's taken forever because of scheduling conflicts. But it's a modified version of James Wallace's Las Vegas.
Very cool.
Yeah, which is kind of awkward because I wrote part of the Las Vegas, but
oh well,
we're not using the stuff I wrote. So
as long as you're having fun, right?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful time. It's really enjoyable.
Okay, well, we are almost out the door, but before I start putting up the chairs, I like to open a little bit of space here on the dance floor, if you will, for if any projects you're working on you want to mention, anything out there that you've done in the past you want to plug, or just, where people can find you online.
Sure. Well, let me run down the laundry list, as it were. My most recent book is A Meeting in the Devil's House. It's a collection of 17 short stories with everything from zombie frogs to a man-eating Sasquatch in a top hat. And I'm very proud of that. It's getting some great reviews, so it makes me happy.
Nice.
There's also some of my writing available for free at Pseudopod, which is an online horror podcast. So if you want to sample, that's where to go. I've got a couple of novels in progress, one of which is with a publisher, one of which I'm doing final edits on. I have the mysterious Possible Comics project, as I can't talk about too much yet. And for my day job, I'm working on Hunt Showdown and really enjoying what we're doing with the world there and the story we're telling there. If you have not seen the the Desolation's Wake trailer, Tide of Desolation was the last event, Desolation's Wake is the current event. If you've not seen the Desolation's Wake trailer, I highly advise checking it out. It's a fun little piece and tells you some of the things we're doing with this monster-haunted hell of a swamp where the real monsters are the people hunting the monsters.
Very cool. Yeah, we didn't even talk about Hunt. Hunt's a fantastic game, too. I interviewed Barbara, a month or two ago, Barbara Frammel, and I gushed then because that's what was the topic of the day. But yeah, we didn't even talk about Hunt. So another time. Great game. Another
time. I am always happy to come back. Thank you for letting me ramble. I apologize if I spoke out of turn at any point.
At no point. All right. Well, before we head out the door, this is where I'm going to give you the last word. So any final bits of parting wisdom before we push everybody out the door here?
Final wisdom for all of you writers out there. The purpose of a first draft is to exist. Write it, finish it. You can go back and revise later, but tell your story first. It doesn't matter if it's broken. It doesn't matter if it could be better. If you start revising before you're done your first pass, you will never reach the end.
Well, as the shadows once more creep into the room and across the floorboards, it's time for me to turn down the fire and push you out the door. Good luck. Richard, thank you for sitting down and sharing your insights, experience, and wisdom. And to you, dear listener, thank you for taking a seat at the table. May you continue exploring, creating, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in the Corner of Story and Game.